Spain had ruled the Philippines since the early 1500s. While over 1,000 islands in the Philippines were inhabited, the capital of Manila dominated culture and commerce. Sugar, hemp, and tobacco were shipped through Manila to the markets of China. But unlike Cuba, whose sugar industry created great wealth for Spain, the Philippines produced little revenue. Spanish missionaries forced the Filipinos to convert to Catholicism and collected taxes on their most fertile lands. Filipinos who pressed for reforms ended up in dungeons or executed. Under the flag of the Katipunan, or Society of the Sons of the People, 20,000 Filipinos staged an uprising in 1896.
They had had too much of Spanish oppression, too much of Spanish control. They had lost virtually their rights and they were living as second-class citizens. And therefore, Filipinos who had held sporadic revolts before 1896 culminated and got together to launch a major nationwide revolution against the Spaniards.
27-year-old Emilio Aguinaldo, the son of a wealthy landowner, rose through the ranks of the revolutionary movement. Aguinaldo became president of the Katipunan in the spring of 1897.
Filipino citizens, let us follow the example of European and American nations. Let us march under the flag of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
With 200,000 troops fighting in Cuba, Spain could not afford a war in the Philippines. Spanish officials approached Aguinaldo with a bid for peace.
And one of the conditions was for the revolutionaries, the leadership anyway, to be exiled to Hong Kong and to be paid a sum of money. And then certain reforms should be instituted in the Philippines.
Though Aguinaldo did not believe that the Spanish would implement the reforms, he needed the money for food and supplies. Aguinaldo agreed to embark for Hong Kong. There, he would purchase arms for shipment back to the Philippines.
To the extent that Americans knew that there was an insurgency in the Philippines, there was a vague sympathy and support. Americans have been at least rhetorically supportive of anti-colonialist, anti-imperial movements from the time of the American Revolution. Compared to the insurgency in Cuba, which Americans knew all about, the Philippines were really a blank spot in the American public's perception.
Congress immediately followed suit. Halfway around the world in Hong Kong, Commodore Dewey received a dispatch from Secretary of the Navy Long.
Proceed at once to the Philippine Islands. Commence operations against the Spanish fleet. Use utmost endeavors.
Just after midnight on May 1st, 1898, Commodore Dewey's flagship Olympia entered Manila Bay. Dewey's 9 ships, modernized to compete with the navies of Europe, had yet to be tested in battle.
Daylight came out behind Manila and revealed gray fortifications. The binoculars showed a cluster of black hulls. 16 Spanish ships were counted. A shell soared toward our line. The plunge of the projectile was followed by the roar of the gun.
Commodore Dewey's squadron made 5 devastating passes at the Spanish fleet. By noon, the Spanish had surrendered their naval base in Manila Bay. 10 Spanish ships were destroyed. 1 U.S. sailor was killed.
That American forces could win a great victory clear on the far side of the world rendered Dewey's victory in the Philippines more amazing and more noteworthy. And when the news got back to the U.S., Americans rejoiced as they hadn't since the Civil War.
Raise a cheer, all earth can hear.
Dewey was the most famous man in the United States.
Spanish-American War was not only the war that probably got the greatest coverage in the newspapers, but it was also the first filmed war. every vaudeville theater tried to show what were called actualities of the war. Most of them were faked. Most of the first films of the war were shot on the roof of New York buildings with toy boats and bathtubs, blowing cigar smoke to simulate the smoke of battle.
Dewey, promoted to Rear Admiral, was ordered to wait in Manila Bay for the U.S. Army. To secure the aid of Filipino insurgents, Dewey sent a ship from his fleet to Hong Kong to pick up Emilio Aguinaldo, the exiled leader of the Philippine Revolution. Dewey welcomed Aguinaldo aboard his flagship in Manila Bay.
Dewey gave him the honors of a general of the revolution. They met in the battleship Olympia, and I think Aguinaldo had developed the idea that while the Filipinos would like to be independent, they needed the protection of the United States, because at that time you have the German interest in the area, French interests, also United Kingdom.
Later on, Aguinaldo wrote in his memoirs that Dewey made promises to support the revolution, but there was one thing wrong, and that was there was no written promise made. Aguinaldo wanted to get a promise, but Dewey said, "My word is stronger than the most strongly written statement there is."
I think if I were going to put myself in the shoes of Aguinaldo, being really naive, you know, he was just a simple general in the Philippines. So he took the word of these Americans as, you know, accepted it as true.
Aguinaldo returned to his family's mansion in Cavite, just southwest of Manila, to devise with his generals a strategy to defeat the Spanish.
Compatriots, divine providence is about to place independence within our reach. The Americans have extended their protecting mantle to our beloved country, now that they have severed relations with Spain, owing to the tyranny that nation is exercising in Cuba. The American fleet will prevent any reinforcements coming from Spain. There, where you see the American flag flying, assemble in numbers. They are our redeemers.
Spain's army in the Philippines was trapped in Intramuros, a walled city within Manila, built by Spanish conquerors 300 years earlier. Aguinaldo's insurgents had besieged the stronghold for nearly 2 months.
They had gotten Manila almost completely surrounded, to the extent that the Spaniards were running low on water and food. And Aguinaldo at this point asked the Spanish commander to surrender Manila to his forces. But the Spaniards, with their sense of pride, refused to do that. They feared that the Filipinos would take vengeance on them, that the Filipinos would murder them and rape their women.
Aguinaldo hoped that Rear Admiral Dewey's fleet would bombard Intramuros and force the Spanish to surrender to the Filipinos. But Dewey had been waiting for U.S. land troops, who began arriving in July.
The Filipinos had been led to believe that the Americans were their redeemers, their liberators, and so for as long as Dewey's fleet was there, it was all right. But when the soldiers came in, then the Filipinos began to have their doubts and became suspicious about American motives. The American soldiers, on the other hand, arrived thinking that they were really going to educate these people, and a lot of them equated the Filipinos with blacks, Negroes, and they looked down on many of them.
The Filipinos were portrayed by the press in a very different way from, say, the way that the Cubans had been portrayed prior to the U.S. intervention. What was more common was to portray the Filipinos as children, so that Uncle Sam would have to come in and establish a kindergarten and would educate the Filipinos for self-government.
The Spanish proposed surrendering to the United States in a mock battle for Manila. Few soldiers would be harmed, and the Spanish would maintain their military honor. Filipinos would be kept out of Intramuros by the U.S. Army.
The Battle of Manila was another one of these things where The Spanish did not want to simply raise their hands in the air and come out surrendering. It was almost like the reenactments that you see today of Civil War battles. Everybody knew who was going to win.
The Spaniards raised the white flag, the Americans rushed into the city as planned, and the Filipinos were left holding an empty bag. Before they knew what had hit them, they were still surrounding Manila, but Manila had changed hands into the Americans.
On August 14th, in the Church of San Agustin, the Spanish handed over formal possession of Manila to the United States. And like General Garcia at Santiago, Aguinaldo and his insurgents were barred from entering the city. Filipino leaders retreated to a monastery north of Manila to organize a government independent of the United States.
The people struggle for their independence, absolutely convinced that the time has come when they can and should govern themselves. Emilio Aguinaldo.
Peace negotiations between the United States and Spain began in Paris on October 1st, 1898. No Filipinos or Cubans had been consulted or invited to attend. Their fate lay in the hands of 10 American and Spanish delegates.
I think at this point, McKinley was not sure in his own mind exactly what he would ask of the Spanish. He was sure that he would ask them to give up Cuba. The real question was what to do with the Philippines. And he decided that he needed the port of Manila in the Philippines in order to have a naval base in the Western Pacific. The question was, how much more than Manila should we have in order to protect Manila?
Congressional elections were just a month away. As President McKinley toured the Midwest to campaign for Republicans, he gauged public opinion on overseas expansion.
We have good money, we have ample revenues, we have unquestioned national credit, but we want new markets. And as trade follows the flag, it looks very much as if we are going to have new markets.
He made speeches in which he would pose the problem something like this. We have established American interests in the flag in the Philippines. Should we take the flag down? And of course, the audience would roar back, no. Should we keep the Philippines as an overseas base? The audience would roar its approval. And McKinley would say, well, I guess they want the Philippines.
The Republicans maintained their majority in Congress. Theodore Roosevelt was elected governor of New York. 5 days later, U.S. treaty negotiators in Paris were cabled President McKinley's terms.
Insist upon the cession of the whole of the Philippines. If necessary, pay to Spain $20 million. Secretary of State John Hay.
Spain accepted the offer and gave up the Philippines and Cuba, in addition to Guam and Puerto Rico. The 400-year-old Spanish Empire, which once included most of the Western Hemisphere, ended with the stroke of a pen. In Manila, U.S. and Filipino soldiers eyed each other suspiciously across a neutral divide. Just 2 days before the final Senate vote, a U.S. Army private on patrol spotted 2 Filipino soldiers crossing the San Juan Bridge to American lines. He shouted for the soldiers to halt.
A Filipino soldier was not understand the word halt. So ignoring that warning, continued. He continued to move towards the American lines. The Americans fired from their end, and there was now a reply on the Filipino end.
There's a strong sentiment that flashes through the Senate that we have to support our boys in the Philippines. I mean, it's like there was a patriotism aroused instead of doubts. I mean, the fighting in the Philippines causes a lot of people to have doubts, but in the Senate, it has the impact of turning a number of people who were thinking of opposing the treaty into supporting it.
2 Democrats switched sides, and the Senate narrowly ratified the treaty. The United States officially acquired its first colonies and its first colonial rebellion. 60 U.S. soldiers and 700 Filipinos had been killed. Rear Admiral Dewey doubled his order of ammunition from Washington to help put a swift end to the Filipino insurrection.
The insane attack of these people upon their liberators. It is not likely that Aguinaldo himself will exhibit much staying power. After 1 or 2 collisions, the insurgent army will break up.
In the Philippines, Aguinaldo's insurgents had no promises of independence, no Teller Amendment. They continued to resist. Within 2 months, they had killed and wounded 500 U.S. soldiers.
Why is it that the American outlook is blacker now than it has been since the beginning of the war? The whole population of the islands sympathizes with the insurgents. The sooner the people of the United States find out that the people of the Philippines do not wish to be governed by us, the better. Harper's Weekly, June 1899.
The Anti-Imperialist League that had begun some months before grew in membership. It's very interesting, especially a number of American women got involved in this. They did not yet have suffrage, and they saw the Filipinos essentially as having their problem. That is to say, they were being governed without their having anything to say about it.
Among the most vocal of anti-imperialist women were members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union.
Again and again has my blood boiled at the hundreds of American saloons being established throughout our new possessions. And shame of shames, our military authorities in the Philippines have introduced the open and official sanction of prostitution. Bessie Scoville, Women's Christian Temperance Union.
What really upset WCTU members were the reports of sexually transmitted diseases. And they were just appalled to find out that boys who they described as pure boys had left their homes and their loving mothers and their strong values and went to the Philippines and instead came home sick, diseased, depraved.
Founder of the Anti-Imperialist League, Edward Atkinson, published pamphlets on venereal disease and sent them to troops in the Philippines.
Atkinson believed that one of the consequences of going into the career of empire was that traditional American principles, such as freedom of speech, would no longer hold. And sure enough, the Postmaster General had the pamphlets seized. And so they never reached the Philippines. And Atkinson was able to go to the public then and say, you see, this is what happens. If we seize the Philippines and go and become an imperialist power, we'll no longer have our freedoms.
In August 1899, the U.S. commander in Manila requested 60,000 reinforcements, quadrupling the size of U.S. forces in the Philippines. Aguinaldo ordered his officers to begin a guerrilla war.
It involved men without uniforms, so they would be able to fade into civilian populations very, very quickly. It involved surprise attacks, raids, without warning. Some of the Filipinos would even wear women's clothing at times to be able to get behind American lines and then hit from the back.
And the way the fighting went on was just utterly alien to the American kids at the beginning of the 20th century in the Philippines, just as it was to the American kids in the late 1960s in Vietnam. And whenever you send an 18 or a 19-year-old out into the world and give them a gun and tell them to go and kill the enemy and to hate the enemy, you're going to have problems. You're going to have the kind of thing that happened at Wounded Knee, or the kind of thing that happened in the Philippines with the American troops torturing their prisoners in the most, you don't want to ever even think about it, ways.
American brutality in the Philippines brought an unexpected supporter to the anti-imperialist movement, William Randolph Hearst.
Letters that were sent to him from American soldiers talked about killing the Filipinos, who they called Indians oftentimes, connecting it to the Indian Wars in the United States. And I think Hearst started seeing that perhaps the whole Spanish-American War was a misadventure, that what possibly worked in Cuba, getting Spain out, was turning out to be disastrous in the Pacific with the Philippines.
Just break the news to Mother. She knows how dear I love her. And tell her not to wait for me, for I'm not coming home.
Talk about dead Indians. Why, they're lying everywhere. The trenches are full of them. Theodore Conley, a Kansas regiment.
Last night, one of our boys was found shot and his stomach cut open. Immediately, orders were received to burn the town and kill every native in sight. I am probably growing hard-hearted, for I am in my glory when I can sight my gun on some dark skin and pull the trigger. A.A. Barnes, 3rd U.S. Artillery.
I don't believe the people in the United States understand the condition of things here. Even the Spanish are shocked. I have seen enough to almost make me ashamed to call myself an American, an anonymous soldier.
The body count in the Philippines worried President McKinley. 3,000 Americans and 15,000 Filipinos had been killed. U.S. generals in Manila were ordered to censor reporters' dispatches that contained any unfavorable news.
American reporters in the Philippines blamed the generals, not the president, for this censorship and their inability to get a lot of this news out. So by the early part of 1900, McKinley was in much better shape politically than he should have been, given the number of casualties and the amount of atrocities that were going on in the Philippine Revolution.
In the Philippines, U.S. troops had posed as prisoners of war to infiltrate rebel headquarters. 3 weeks after President McKinley's March inauguration, they captured rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo.
There has been enough blood, enough tears, enough desolation. By accepting the sovereignty of the United States, I believe I am serving thee, my beloved country. Emilio Aguinaldo.
While war continued in the southern Philippines, there were few skirmishes around Manila in the summer of 1901. President McKinley appointed William Howard Taft the first civilian governor of the Philippines. Big Bill Taft called the Filipinos his little brown brothers. McKinley described Taft's mission as one of benevolent assimilation.
What was established here very quickly were schools and the introduction of American methods of education, English language, except that the American administration in the Philippines passed a law which made illegal anything that was anti-American, whether it was written, spoken, or even a picture. The Philippine flag was banned, although Filipinos found other ways to continue the struggle.
Ten days after President McKinley's death, the residents of Balangiga, a tiny village 400 miles southeast of Manila, attacked the local U.S. garrison. While U.S. soldiers ate breakfast, the church bells rang a signal. Filipinos brandishing machetes emerged from their hiding places. 48 Americans, 2/3 of the garrison, were butchered.
To the Filipinos, this was seen as a victorious battle on the side of the revolution, but to the Americans, it was seen as an atrocity of the gravest proportions.
On the orders of General Jacob Smith, U.S. troops retaliated against the entire island of Samar, where Balangiga is located.
I want no prisoners. I want all persons killed who are capable of bearing arms against the United States.
I'd like to know the limit of age to respect, sir.
10 years. General Jacob Smith.
And his troops followed the order to the letter, burning villages, killing men, and actually even women and children, and converting Samar into really a howling wilderness.
Oh, I'm only a common soldier in the blasted Philippines.
They say I've got brown brothers here, but I don't know what it means. I like the word fraternity, but still I draw the line. Oh, he may be a brother of Big Bill Taft, but he ain't no brother of mine.
In Batangas, a province south of Manila, U.S. officers herded all non-insurgents into fortified zones. Everyone outside these zones was considered an enemy and captured or killed. The similarities to Spanish methods in Cuba were unmistakable. Leading anti-imperialist Senator George Hoar insisted on public hearings to try those responsible for these atrocities. 3 Army officers, including General Jacob Smith, were court-martialed.
You have sacrificed nearly 10,000 American lives. You have slain uncounted thousands of the people you desired to benefit. You have established reconcentration camps. Your statesmanship has succeeded in converting a grateful people into enemies possessed of a hatred which centuries cannot eradicate. Senator George Hoar.
In April 1902, after more than 3 years of fighting, Filipino insurgents surrendered to the United States.
By the end of the war, Americans simply had no stomach for any more colonies. Even Roosevelt himself was forced to conclude that the Americans were not an imperial people. He said that the Philippines had become America's Achilles heel.
He should have listened harder in 1898 to a lot of people who were saying at that time, we're going to acquire these foreign people about whom we know very little or nothing, who are way, way far away, who have a culture that is not a part of ours, that's just south of Japan. They're good. If we have those islands, it's going to draw us into a war in the Pacific. And it's going to be a very bloody and very tough war to fight.
In World War II, Japan conquered the Philippines. 60,000 Americans and more than 1 million Filipinos were killed driving the Japanese from the islands. Soon after, the United States granted the Filipinos their independence.